The book of Revelations offers one of the most detailed and vivid descriptions of heaven found anywhere in the Bible. Yet what stands out to me is how human many of these descriptions feel. Images of golden streets, incense, and structured praise resemble many of the ways humans have historically expressed beauty, reverence, and authority. This raises an interesting question. If heaven is the domain of an eternal, non-human being, why does it appear so closely aligned with human aesthetic values? So just for clarity, my goal here isn't to disprove anything. It is to rather introduce an interesting question that I think is worth sitting with. Now that specific question is, where does the human influence end and the divinity begin in John's account of heaven? So just to start us off, I'm going to give some context surrounding Jewish tradition, Roman culture, materialistic culture, and the writing of the texts themselves, so we can better understand how human influence could have crept its way into the writing of these texts. Now, if you don't really care or already have a good grasp on this concept, you can skip to this timestamp where we'll get into the verses themselves. Now, the writing of Revelations itself is generally considered to have taken place during the late 1st century. This would have been under the rule of the tyrannical emperor Domitian. Now, this is a period in time defined by intense Christian persecution and excessive displays of power using precious materials, such as gold, in public architecture, and by Domitian himself to make the public perceive him as a sort of deity. According to early Christian tradition, John, the writer of Revelations, is said to have been exiled to the island of Patmos. Now, whether you take this literally or symbolically, it's important because it places the text in the midst of Roman influence. Now, later in history, the text would find itself circulating among Christian communities in Asia Minor, which is now modern-day Turkey. It is also important to remember that Christian religious tradition emerged directly from Jewish religious tradition, which relied heavily on materialistic symbolism at the time, such as golden sacred places, incense at ritualistic practices, and carefully structured sacred environments and holy temples. Given this background, it just seems pretty natural that John would find some of his beliefs surrounding what is divine influenced by Jewish tradition. Now, this materialistic Jewish culture wasn't just for decoration, it was a way to express proximity to the divine. Now, with this context in mind, let's look at some of the verses and Revelations itself that describe the physical beauty of heaven and try and figure out where human influence could take a play. So the first verse we'll cover is Revelations 21:18. The building material of its wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold, clear as glass. Now, it's interesting that jasper should show up here. Biblically, it has showed up in verses like Exodus 28:20. The fourth row shall be beryl, an onyx, and a jasper. Hey, editor me here. Just to be clear, scholars generally think that while John was writing Revelations, he was in a trance-like state. This can't be concretely proven. It's just something to keep in mind for this next portion. So I see two distinct possibilities here. Number one is that humans are naturally drawn to nice-looking objects. You can see jasper here. It's pretty nice-looking. And consequently, we associate it with beauty and divinity. The second is that jasper itself already had some sort of established symbolicism previous to Revelation's writing, which we can see in the Exodus verse I gave earlier. Consequently, John could have been aware of Jasper's inclusion in Exodus. He could have read it and then subconsciously, while in his translate state, written it into the physical descriptions of heaven itself. But none of this really matters. If the Bible is truly divinely inspired, then of course the same stones are going to show up again, right? It's consistent. But there's some secular examples, or at least non-Christian slash Jewish, that we can look towards. One example is of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. Sorry if I butchered that name. He has a whole jasper sculpture of his head, which you can see here. Another example is of the Shema seal, which unfortunately doesn't have any surviving photographs as far as I can tell of it in its true jasper glory. So this is either bronze or iron cast of it. Now, I'll admit, it's very unlikely that John had any sort of knowledge of the Shema seal or Akhenaten's head. But what's important to recognize here is that jasper already had an established importance throughout history as a precious metal. Now, we can't forget that in Revelations 21:18, gold is also mentioned as part of heaven's physical description. Now, it's probably not a stretch to say that gold's been used as a symbol of power throughout human history. I mean, there's a myriad of examples in the Bible itself of gold being used, and literally throughout history, so we don't really have to, dig deep here. But at the times, gold was used specifically by Domitian, if you remember, that's the emperor. He would wear a gold crown, he had gold coins with his face on them, and this was all an attempt to make him seem like a deity. So even outside of Christian and Jewish practice, gold was seen as something to take you closer to the divine. All of this is to say that I think it's very safe to assume that John's use of gold in the physical description of heaven is really just closely tied to the zeitgeist, of gold being the primary precious metal that's used to display power. Now, for our second verse, we have Revelations 3 through 4, chapter 8. Another angel with a golden incense burner came and stood at the altar. He was given a large amount of incense to offer with the prayer of all the saints. So traditionally, incense has been associated with holiness, especially in Jewish worship, which we've already established gave way to Christian traditional worship. Now, there are other examples outside of Jewish and Christian tradition of incense being used, such in the case of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. He would throw massive orgies where incense played hand in hand with the experience. So when incense arrives in Revelations, it's pretty safe to assume that that's just because John already had an understanding of what it was and thought it important enough to put in Revelations. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I do want to say, though, that again, I'm not attacking anybody or beliefs or anything like that. And I do recognize Revelations as a very, very beautiful piece of what I believe to be symbolism. And I don't think we should just completely discredit John's writings just because, oh, there could have been some outside secular influence. Like, honestly, who cares? It's a great piece of literature, and it's very moving and powerful and weird. If you haven't read Revelations, you probably should, man. It's quite the read. So this was my first big, or not big. This is the first video I really researched. My last one was, it's just kind of an experiment or thoughts that I had before, I wanted to share. So if you like this kind of content, please tell me. I'll make more for sure. I'm still working on that video debunking a young Earth creationist. I'm really digging deep here. I'm getting into the Abeka system, which is a homeschool curriculum, very infamous. And I've got a young Earth creationist guide book, basically. That's what it is. I don't know, man. So I'm working on that. That's pretty much it.